A new documentary is screening at the Brisbane International Film Festival on the 23rd of October, and then hopefully will be released later on elsewhere, a film called Ramblin Racer. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the writer-director of Ramblin Racer, Neil McGregor. Neil, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Peter, thank you very much for having me.
How did this documentary about these two wannabe motorsport racers, two guys who want to be involved in motorsports, how did it all come about?
Kind of quite organically, really. So we had I kind of knew Tim, one of the guys who's a construction manager, through sort of other circles, and he just was saying he's going to do motorsports with his best friend Phil, who's an accountant, and just kind of an off-the-cuff kind of comment. He said, "Oh, I might be doing this. Maybe it might make a good documentary." So it sort of kind of just started from there. And I said, "Oh, that actually probably would be a really good story in that. You know, two underdogs have no idea what they're doing, don't have any racing experience, mechanical know-how." And they wanted to become motorsports racers. So I kind of said to them, I said, well, why don't we, put some cameras to it and let's see where the story goes. So that's kind of how it sort of started. And then I asked him, when's the first race? And he said, a couple of weeks, we're picking up some car shells and we're turning them into to race cars. So I kind of thought, well, this probably has a lot of conflict and spanners in the works. So let's just see where it goes, and that's kind of how it all just started.
What an interesting idea that's become a documentary, and of course it must be so interesting for you as the director of the documentary, because you had no idea where this was going, whether they'd be successful at all, whether the whole thing could become pear-shaped, and we won't do any spoilers about what happens in the documentary, but that's always a challenge for a filmmaker like yourself about constructing the story and the outcome.
Look, it certainly is, and it's certainly going into it. I kind of wrote a little bit of a treatment. I kind of knew the general kind of process they were going to go through. They were going to buy these car shells, start in a suburban garage in Brisbane, turn them into race cars, go through the lower classes of racing, and then hopefully get into the Gold Coast V8 Utes. So that was kind of the very loose plan, and sort of, I guess, where I kind of wanted to take this sort of story, and is I really kind of wanted to be very much a fly on the wall. I think seeing the everyday man achieve these kind of impossible dreams is quite kind of something. And I think it also, in a subtext kind of way, also explores kind of like, I guess, the mateship in the in masculine in the modern kind of world a little bit. I think that's a very interesting sort of thing that isn't explored. And I think car culture is very much part of Australian culture too. So I kind of want to sort of explore these kinds of themes and really kind of tap into this underdog thematic, achieving impossible dreams. I think those kind of two pillars is kind of what I focused on. And in terms of how we sort of approached it, was all single cam, in-car cameras as well. And really kind of just being there. And I wanted kind of the audience to feel like they were sort of a part of this journey. They were there in the garage as they were under the car with Tim and Phil. They were in the seat next to them in, when they're having wins, and all they're having, not great wins and, not so great days if they have a bingle or a car crash here and there. So that you really kind of got to kind of feel what it was like to really kind of roll up your sleeves and be in the pits with them. I didn't think it was so much to be the fast-paced, very stylized kind of thing, which we could have done, and we do to some degree because it is motorsports. But I think that wasn't kind of the tact I wanted to take with this, and really kind of peel back those layers so you get to know who these people are. They are just like you and I and anyone you walk past on the street. They're just everyday people that go, what, I'm just going to give it a crack. And I think that's what makes this such a fascinating story, quite inspiring one too.
Yes, definitely. I'm wondering, it's good that you had Linda involved as well, Tim's wife. How much permission did all three of them, I suppose, give you in terms of what you filmed and what they, I suppose, allowed you to have in the final version, and what they said, well, maybe we don't want this bit in there, all that sort of thing.
Look, I mean, I think it was pretty, like they're pretty open with it. And I think a lot of it, when you're directing a project, be it narrative, which a lot of my kind of work comes from, or it's a documentary, you kind of have to earn the trust and rapport with your subjects and your talent, and they kind of let you more and more in on their story. So you kind of do that sort of dance a little bit, especially early on, and considering we kind of just jumped in and started, it sort of didn't give them too much of a time to kind of overthink things. They were just kind of like, very much became a part of what I was doing as part of their journey, and it was very entwined. We sort of wanted to focus more on the motorsports. We didn't really want to kind of tackle too much in like the personal world of it. It would felt too much like a distraction. It didn't really add anything to the story. And I also think in sort of the 90 minutes, it didn't really have a place to put that in. The reason I wanted to have Linda in there, which is Tim's wife, is I think it's important to have a female voice in this. I think it's a lot stronger for audiences. But another reason for that is Tim's he's a tradie. He's a plasterer. He's the everyday Aussie male who doesn't want to let his emotions show. And when you go into the world of motorsports, you're going to have great days and you're going to have shit days. So when it comes to talking about your emotions, about how you're really feeling, I think the best place to really kind of get a snapshot in that window of how he really felt, or what he didn't really sort of say or not want to say, is having a conversation with his wife. So it kind of has a dual purpose there of having a female voice in motorsports, but also kind of captures a little bit of how Tim was kind of feeling, because Tim's very much a just jump in and just go. And Phil, who's his best mate, is an accountant, so he's a bit more of the voice of reason. He's a little bit more takes the time to articulate his words. And I think having the three of them there really added a nice dynamic of kind of how this journey kind of unfolded.
Okay, very good. And of course, the whole motorsport industry is hardly a cheap sort of industry. It's quite expensive, the parts, engines, labour, all sorts of things involved. So I suppose there's also a message about that you can't get into this lightly, because you could be up for considerable expenses.
Yes, I think there's two things you need in motorsports to succeed, and that's money and dreams. And I think that's also probably not necessarily the right order, but that's probably the main order to achieve. And it's a costly sport. They race two different kinds of cars in the documentary. They do the V8 Utes, which is it's a national series, and it's very expensive. Hardware, mechanics, you got to pick crew, all the rest of it. So if you have accidents and bingles and that's obviously going to be very expensive. But they started out in late 1970s Holden Geminis. So they are vintage cars, very, very expensive. So if you have a crash in those, they take a bit of punishment, and you can just rip off a fender and get a hammer and, put them together and MacGyver that to get it back on the track again, which is why they make a really good class of racing to get into the sports. But when you've got cars that are 40 odd years old, and you've got to try and track down different parts, and it's a discontinued vehicle, trips to wreckers and going on to Gumtree and those kinds of places to try and track down these different parts, different car shells, can be a very not only expensive hobby, as those parts become older and older and harder to find and more sparse, but also very difficult just to track down.
It sure would be, yes. But so I admire their perseverance and so on in doing that. I noticed you've put in a music score by Luke McDonald. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's just on that perseverance there, just before I jump on to talk about the score that Luke did. I think that was quite interesting, because it's from the filmmaking point of view, at points where I'm like, I'm not sure where and how this story is going to go. I think Tim and Phil's kind of perseverance to keep on going is quite something that, for anyone who's outside of motorsports, but just generally about achieving anything in life, just the way they would have a crash and find a way to get back on track, have a squabble and do something to do what they need to do. It was quite inspiring. I think there's something in that I think a lot of people who even don't like motorsports will definitely appreciate and get something out of. So the music score by Luke McDonald, I've worked with him a couple of times before on some other projects on the narrative space. Incredibly talented musician. And I brought him in very early into the editing process. Sort of as we were sort of cutting, we had sort of a pretty fine sort of edit coming along. But I wanted to bring the music in, and I brought Luke in very early into the editing process, much earlier than we kind of normally would. So what I did with Luke was I kind of wrote him a brief, and I put together a Spotify playlist of a very 1970s inspired track, a lot of ELO and David Bowie and sort of that late sort of 1970s kind of sounds, kind of inspired obviously from the cars that they're racing. I also kind of thought that also is probably a large part of the audience that they will be listening to. So Luke done an absolutely amazing job that really underscored the whole documentary, sort of brought in these kinds of ebbs and flows for the character journey with these kind of theme scores in. And he just absolutely just nailed the tone of it. And I think it really helped lift the documentary into something that it's quite a fun kind of adventure that you kind of go on. And I think the journey really paces that out nicely, helped along by the music significantly.
Yep, it is. It works very well. Tell me about the editing process, because obviously in documentaries, the actual fashioning of a film is in the editing and what you decide to leave in and leave out. That must have been quite a challenge for you.
Yes, we had a lot of shots and cameras, in-car cameras, cameras stationed around car races. And when you do documentary, it's a help and a hindrance. It can be very forgiving if you miss moments or it's not quite as clean dialogue-wise. Sometimes that's kind of part of what it is, the style you're going for. But we had, hours and hours of footage of just cameras set on racetracks to hopefully capture moments of either a crash or a spin out or just capturing the car coming around the corner. So that was kind of one sort of part of it, and figuring out which races we wanted to include. And then the other bits were in the pits, in the garage, where we're kind of capturing those kinds of moments. It was all shot just single cameras. And we just kind of, I sort of got a lot of coverage where we were, figured out what was kind of happening. So that definitely helped the edit along. And Navaz and I started cutting, and then obviously with COVID created a few challenges. So I would say the better part of 80% of it was edited via video chats, just like we're doing now. We'd jump on and do an edit session, send some notes, upload some bits, make some notes back and forth. And we just kind of went through in sort of the 3 acts, and we did a lot of video chats back and forth. And it was, Navaz did an absolutely fantastic job of just finessing and really finding those kinds of moments. There was probably only a few scenes that we ended up cutting from our initial sort of assembly edit, but a lot of like the bones of it was there. And Navaz fleshed out the coverage to really kind of make these scenes sort of something more. And I think that's something I was kind of wanting to try and find through the edit. It's just little things that have a deeper meaning or a subtext to them. So there's a scene at the start where Tim goes into the doctor's surgery and he gets all the medical, kind of like an astronaut, when they go through all the kind of the things. And then it's, a bit where it kind of gets measured, stands up against the wall, and he the nurse asked him, how tall do you think you are? And he's like 181 and he's 178. And I think those kinds of little moments of like Tim always kind of coming up short, always think he's bigger than, taller than he actually kind of is, really kind of epitomizes the character. So we tried to kind of go through, and we did a few passes of just kind of bringing those kinds of elements into the edit. And I think that's really helped shape the story and kind of made these characters very real.
Yes, yes. And I also like the way you use split screen from time to time as well. That can be effective.
Yeah, it's probably also another one too. So there's a few reasons to why that. Early on, I kind of wanted to have some split screen. I felt like it would be a really good way of covering the moments and kind of helping the audience kind of understand that when you're in the race car seat, there's a lot of things going on, but all simultaneously things around you. And one wrong move and you spin out of your crash. Or sometimes because of a single camera on a very tight budget, the characters would be going in different directions. So it kind of allowed us to sort of go, something's going on here while something's going here. So that was, sort of a device that we knew we were kind of wanting to have in the edit. And as we kind of went more and more, we added more in and then kind of pulled back a little bit and then kind of, I guess, left in the middle there. So it was sort of, I guess, a kind of a nice device that I think really helped add a little bit of style too. And I guess that's kind of a bit of a 70s kind of flair to it that, that kind of, I guess, got invoked there a little bit with the music, with the split screen. Even probably the color grade as well probably brought some of that kind of 70s stylings in. So that's kind of how the split screen stylings kind of emerged.
Okay, very good. So tell me, how did Tim and Phil react when they saw the final version of your documentary?
It's a good question. We'll find out more. I haven't seen it on the big screen yet, so at Brisbane Film Festival, they'll probably, I think that'll be, a more real viewing for them, because they'll be able to sort of, I think it'd be the first time for them to actually kind of sit back and appreciate the journey that they had with an audience. And I think that's a very different experience. But in terms of them actually sitting and watching their journey kind of unfold, I think it's a little bit like all of us going, oh, geez, why did we do this? And, oh, I remember that day. I forgot about that. That's a really kind of a nice moment. So I think it really, they are on the same roller coaster journey of them as themselves that the film actually takes the audience on. And it's a nice, nostalgic moment, I think, for them. And I think they're probably a little bit humbled. Especially Phil, I think, is quite humbled that, I was just kind of a little bit of a fly on the wall filming, not really sure what would come of all that. So I think for him, it was certainly something that, and I don't want to speak for either of them, but I think they're both quite humbled for it and quite proud and a little bit chuffed, I think. And likewise with Tim, I definitely think he's very chuffed in being able to kind of sit back and see from, for the moment they turn the key to where they got, is certainly something they're quite proud of.
Great. And as we said, the film is premiering at the Brisbane International Film Festival on October 23rd. After that, how else will the film be rolled out?
So that'll be the second screening, actually. We're in conversations with distribution sales for Australia and New Zealand. So hopefully maybe cinema, maybe streaming. So that's a very active conversation. So that'll be probably the next thing on there. And then obviously worldwide distribution outside of Australia and New Zealand will be next.
Okay, very good. And Neil, I'm intrigued because I read that, your previous film, a film called The Little Things. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, tell me about that film. It's one that I don't think I'm familiar with.
No, so that was done on a very, very small budget. We had a Screen Queensland, Screen Australia budget for a micro budget initiative there. So we made it on very little. We interestingly didn't get a great distribution deal for that, which it didn't get a very good release, at least here in Australia and New Zealand. It got okay in North America, but it was a very different thing, a far cry from obviously motorsports. It's a narrative feature film about a girl who believes she can change the world by moving small objects around. And it's a supernatural rom-com kind of thing. So it's a really, really fantastic script and a great cast as well. And that's, it was shot in my family home for very little. And it was my first film. So it was a very steep learning curve for me as a filmmaker. Did well on the film festival circuit at the time, and got a lot of strong festival reviews, won some awards and things like that. So that was sort of my first foray into filmmaking. Okay.
And I also read that, did you work in Canada as an assistant director on various films, including Deadpool and what did I read, Godzilla and 50 Shades of Grey?
Yes, don't hold that one against me. So that's like on the back of that film, The Little Things, I moved over to Canada. So I just landed in Canada, got a working visa with a few dollars in my back pocket, or a few loonies as you'd call it in Canada. And just started production assisting in locations and assistant directing departments, and was fortunate to get onto some big films. So I was on Godzilla, 50 Shades of Grey, The Flash, Grumpy Cat, a whole bunch of sort of other films. I worked on The Interview, the Seth Rogen, James Franco movie where they assassinate the leader of North Korea. So that resulted in me ending up on WikiLeaks, which was certainly an interesting experience. And while I was over there, I was directing commercials and doing sort of, I guess, unofficial second unit directing, splinter units with assistant director units, as well as kind of locations department. That's sort of, I guess, the way they sort of do it there. And that certainly kind of helped that I got to work on these really fantastic big blockbuster projects, all the time. So I was able to kind of absorb a lot from working with all those crews and heads of departments and directors and cinematographers, and really you probably learned more than you do in film school, just by doing and being around it day after day. You sort of learn the things that make films, really, beyond just obviously the fundamental kind of aesthetics that you can all read in the book. So that was a few years I was over there before getting headhunted by the Film Commission in Queensland to come and bring international blockbusters to come shoot in Queensland. So I left Canada, I think Deadpool, I got Deadpool and had 4 days, I think, and came back and started working at the Queensland Film Commission to attract international productions to come shoot in Queensland.
Well done on that. And I can imagine the experience in Canada working on those major films must have been quite instructive. And I suppose you would have seen a contrast between the way they make films in Canada, or certainly with the major films, and in Australia. That must have been really interesting for you.
It certainly is. Like it is interesting that like films largely are all very universal in what stories they tell, but also how they're made, right? They're all very universal kind of beasts. It's sort of the subtle nuances. When it comes down to the actual factory floor kind of elements, that's when they definitely do things a lot more differently. British Columbia in Canada has a lot better tax incentives than Australia in terms of what you can sort of get. They're also 3 hours from LA as well, which helps. Whereas Australia is a 15-hour flight for a lot of actors and producers, and the tax incentives are a lot differently kind of structured, I suppose. So, on that sort of side of it, it's very different. And in terms of how they do the cruise sort of side of things, also a very different beast as well. Different departments kind of work a little bit differently. But I mean, by and large, it's all pretty much the same when it comes down to it. It's just a slightly it's like a car. It's a slightly different kind of European car to an Australian car, just a slightly different kind of way that they do things. Indicators on the left and that one's on the right.
Good analogy. I like that. So tell me, Neil, are you working on any other films at the moment?
I have a few. So I've got a slate of a few projects. Obviously, Ramblin Racer was obviously a very big kind of beast, and we're just kind of packaging it up for distribution conversations. So that'll be kind of, I guess, at the forefront. I produce TV commercials and things like that, which obviously keeps me sort of busy. But I've got a State of Origin project, which is in option script development. So we're in conversations there. And then I've got probably another sort of 5 films that are a bit more kind of active in terms of conversations with pre-sales and development and those kinds of things. So we're just sort of getting a slate of projects. And I think it is a very interesting landscape at the moment that's changing with how films are financed. I recently had a film fall over, a $3 million film fall over, just as I was finishing up Ramblin Racer. So that was obviously quite, devastating to kind of have 2 years of working in that in amongst COVID and having an actor come out of quarantine and have it fall over because, the reasons for it. But, that's obviously a very hard thing to kind of wrap something like that up and go on to the next film. And, that's something I really find that you have, you got to have a few different kind of projects sort of at different sort of stages. And the other thing I find too is it's, finding the stories that speak to you. Something with Ramblin Racer is a story that I guess kind of found me, but I always kind of thought there was something really strong in this. And I think there is a temptation now in how, box office cinemas, obviously that whole landscape sort of changes, finding stories that have diversity, inclusion and things like that, but being very authentic in that space too, in characters and story. It's a lot more kind of layers for the right reasons too, to really kind of explore that. But it's, I think you got to really find a story that you want to tell that speaks to you. And if you think there's a place in the market for that, an audience out there for that, I think it's really important to tell stories, perhaps more than ever, really. But I think to the challenges that filmmakers face now, to be able to tell those stories with budgets, COVID, other challenges around ensuring that you have diversity inclusion quotas for funding, depending how you go, and sensitivities around culture are all very fundamental and necessary steps to make sure you're doing them the right way. But it's definitely having a lot of different projects on your slate that speak to you and other people, and then going about it the right way is very, very important. So it's, that's kind of where I'm at the moment, is really finding those stories that speak, that have a stronger calling that audiences out there will see something in.
Very good. No, I like that explanation, that description. That's great. Thanks for that, Neil. And last question I love asking all filmmakers, apart from your own films, of course, have you seen anything else of late, either in cinema or on streaming or whatever, that has impressed you?
That's a very good question. I think that is the ultimate irony of us as filmmakers spend so much time making films. We don't have time to go and watch films. I've seen a lot of it's harder and harder to find good films. I've watched Squid Game. I thought that was kind of a great as a TV series, but I've also liked to kind of revisit older films. I recently watched The Conversation with Gene Hackman, which is a Francis Ford Coppola film from the 70s. Very impressive, very underrated film. And interestingly, I guess the story of that is he's a sort of a spy person who uses sound to listen into these kinds of conversations and try and figure out what's going on. I'm not sure if you've seen the film, Peter.
I have.
Yeah, and it's a very clever film, and the sound design is phenomenal. Just that unsettling kind of whirl, which kind of, I guess, gets tied into the kind of the wheels of the audio things that he's always kind of listening to, and the whole world just seems to be spiraling out of control further and further. So that's probably the other film I've most recently watched that I quite liked.
It's a very good choice. It's a very interesting film, and it's part of that sort of paranoid cinema that America was making in the 70s. Parallax View, 3 Days of the Condor. There were other films around that time that were all sort of really worried about what was going on in terms of democracy and in terms of power and control, etc. So, yeah, Conversation fits into that really nicely.
Very, very, fitting of what's going on now a little bit, isn't it? It's fitting of the time.
Yes, I didn't want to make that parallel, but you're right. Absolutely right. Look, congratulations on Ramblin Racer. We've been speaking to Neil McGregor, who's the writer-director of Ramblin Racer, screening at the Brisbane Film Festival and then hopefully elsewhere after that. Neil, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great to chat.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Cheers.